By the end of 2015, the global war on terror will cost the US taxpayers nearly $2 trillion, which means that one of the costliest predicaments facing us all, the multi-trillion-dollar predicament of our time, is the costly war that demands the lives of our sons and daughters, and yet there's no end in sight for it. But if we have no way of ending terrorism, shouldn't we be looking for ways other than war to defeat it? If we send missions to Mars on a quest to find life, don't we owe it to the living here on this planet to keep them from war? Perhaps in 99 instances, war may be inevitable. Still, the rest of us cannot help but keep searching, exploring, hoping, exhausting every other possible way for that one way where terrorism can be vanquished without a war. That one way is the reason why I stand here before you today. It is to tell the story of one such possibility, a great but mostly unknown instance of terrorism suffering a great defeat without a war, that I'm here before you on this stage. The story presented itself to me in the form of a middle-aged man in the middle of my kitchen several years ago. When I first met him, it seemed as though he had crossed the oceans just to come to the United States to pour his heart out to me. I spent the next 4 years listening to him and to others whose lives had been affected by this story, investigating the many complex aspects of it. And at the end, I was rewarded by learning how he and those others had brought a miracle about and made history. They had indeed waged a very effective war against a very evil enemy and had succeeded at doing so without firing a single shot, dropping a single bomb, or placing a single soldier in harm's way. The man in my kitchen came to me at the most Dickensian moment of my life, in the best of times and in the worst of times. It was the best of times because I had just published my memoir, which had been well received. Since the reviews all attested to the fact that I'd done well, my publisher wanted me to do a sequel. It was the worst of times because I had no intention of writing a sequel. And I really despised the word memoirist, which implied somehow that I was less than a real writer. To add to my predicament, I was 8 months pregnant. 8 months pregnant with twins. Boy, twins. The man in my kitchen was a first-time visitor to the US, and my husband, who distantly knew him and had invited him to dinner, was as usual late. So the two of us, really the four of us, stood in the middle of the kitchen chopping onions, and I tried to be a gracious host and make small talk. So I turned to him and asked, "So tell me a little about yourself." To which, after a few hems and haws, he said, "Well, I was at a dinner event in Berlin, Germany at a restaurant a few years ago where 2 men burst into that restaurant with machine guns and shot everyone. And I happened to throw myself under a table, and this is how I survived, but 4 of the people who were with me at that table died." How's that for small talk? Here's how that gut-wrenching, yet splendid story begins. In a perfectly indistinct corner of Berlin, Germany, on a perfectly indistinct day in September, in the most indistinct Persian restaurant disguised as Greek called Mykonos in the year 1992. Except that the sum of all those indistinct parts was the scene of the assassination he had survived, and the investigation and the trial that ensued added up to one of the most exceptional moments in the history of jurisprudence in 20th century, one of the most groundbreaking legal cases in the history of Europe since World War II, and one of the most groundbreaking stories about how Europe, namely Germany, did right by refugees from a Muslim land, namely Iran, and in the process, turned them into devoted German citizens. And more, it put the most terrifying genie of our era back in its bottle. And yet, all of that was achieved without a war. These two men, the older one being the chairman of the Democratic Party of Iran's Kurdistan at the time, and two young deputies who are not in this picture, had been the official guests at a conference in Germany on the evening of September 17, 1992. They arrived at the Mykonos restaurant at 8:30 p.m. This was their last evening in Germany, and the next morning they were due at the airport to other destinations. A notable Iranian dissident, the man in the blue shirt, living in Germany, hosted a dinner for them with a few leading expats in Berlin. At about 9:45, two men with their shirt collars rolled up to their eyes burst into the restaurant and rushed into the dimly back room in the back of the restaurant where the nine were seated. And the more hulking of the two stationed himself across from the chairman, shouted an obscenity, dipped his hand into the sports bag that was hanging from his shoulder, and then there were sparks of fire. 3 rounds of machine gun fire followed with several single shots, the coup de grace. Of the 9 men, 4 died, leaving not just their families devastated, but in the case of the chairman, also a major community had lost their remarkable leader. When the man in my kitchen told me of how he had survived, I found myself both saddened and curious. I did not wonder about what almost everyone had asked my guests, the gory details of the shooting and the moments of carnage. I found myself curious about a whole other set of questions. What's it like to go back home after that cataclysm? Did he go to sleep when he arrived home for the first time? Could he sleep? Or did he shower? How does the water feel on the skin of someone who has just dodged death? Did he rush to see his daughter? How does the embrace of a 9-year-old child feel after such an unexpected resurrection? The winner of the 2015 Nobel Prize in Literature, the Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich, said, "I'm not interested in events, in the history of events. I'm interested in the history of emotions." This is precisely the quest that I was on at the time. The man in my kitchen was a fantastic raconteur, to be sure, but the untold story of the attempt on his life, his survival, the way he went on to fight the killers, and recast his life's purpose in the light of that evening really, truly moved me. Such a story as important as this seemed to me was no longer his alone. It was a pebble tossed into a lake, its great glorious rings rippling, enveloping all the lives that live in that water. I live in that water. I too am and was once a refugee, like the man in the middle of my kitchen. I too go to a lot of events organized by the diaspora community. I too could have been at that dinner event in that restaurant, because when we were all forced out of our homeland, out of Iran, most of us went to Europe first. It was just a stroke of luck that I landed a visa and came to the United States. Otherwise, I could have been in Germany, and who knows, I might have been at that restaurant that night. In other words, maybe once upon a time, our stories of births and beginnings were distinct. But the stories of us since our exodus all merge into one great narrative of dispossession. We have all been disowned and rejected, bobbing and drifting through geography and history. In short, I began to think that the story of the man in my kitchen was my own story, or at least an extension of my own history. And I could be the writer who pens his memoirs, my memoirs. A few months later, after tens of hours of interviews with him, with my suitcase in hand and the breast pump on my back, I flew to Berlin to do a few preliminary research and see if I really wanted to spend the next few years writing this book. I spare you the details of what it was like for my breast pump to be detained by the TSA at the airport. They wanted to see how it worked. In Berlin, one final encounter convinced me that this was going to be the story that I would write. As I sat down to interview one of the widows of the 4 victims, she asked me where I had flown in from. The US, I said. Then, out of nowhere, she asked me where I had been on the day of 9/11. I said that, in fact, I'd been en route to my office in New York City. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she said that she had been unable to move from her television set on the day of 9/11, that she had taken not only the day, but the whole week off, and called in sick. All she had wanted to do that week, she told me, was to fly to New York and be with the widows. She felt their 9/11 because of her own 9/17. Berlin, New York, 1992, 2001, her story of the loss of her husband, our New York stories of the loss of hundreds of husbands. It was in meeting her that the proverbial dots were connected in my mind. For a community of refugees and exiles, for those shaped by loss, all the individual stories come together to create one community's narrative. Only one emotional history of the tragically affected. And yes, I was going to write this story and be a memoirist, but for a people, for a forgotten, stricken people. For this assassination had not been a lone incident. Several dozen such assassinations had already occurred in 1992, and each time the killers had, for the most part, gotten away. Let me explain. Here in the West, we came to know the word fatwa in 1998. It was a death order that Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, issued against the writer Salman Rushdie for having published a book, if you remember, called The Satanic Verses, which he found to be offensive to Islam. But long before the rest of the world came to learn the term, Iranian intellectuals, singers, satirists, artists, opposition figures had been target of these kinds of fatwas. The Ayatollah himself had drawn a list of 500 people, and his henchmen were trotting the globe, killing them one by one in Bali, Indonesia, in Rome, in Paris, in Geneva, in London, even here in the US, in Washington, D.C. Some of the killers were apprehended, but were sent back to Iran or Lebanon as European high officials cited national interest. Astounding, but true. Which is why at first the German administration had hoped to shove this unfortunate incident under the rug, like others elsewhere, but not this time. And not in an uncompromising and scrutinizing city like Berlin. What makes this such an earth-shattering exception is precisely this. For one thing, the German Attorney General at the time, Alexander von Stahl, assigned the equivalent of Atticus Finch to investigate the case. Within less than a year, the prosecutor had written a lengthy indictment in which Iran's Minister of Intelligence had been implicated as one of the masterminds of the assassinations. I kept talking about the assassinations. This is the gut-wrenching scene that I didn't want to show. The Attorney General could have refused to sign that indictment, keeping, as many colleagues had suggested, the scope of the trial small and One judge had even suggested that he just lock up a couple of the perpetrators that they had in custody and call it a trial. But neither of these men, the Attorney General or the prosecutor, were willing to do anything less than what the absolute truth and their sense of integrity dictated. Neither bowed to pressure from any source, no matter how high. Let me spoil the ending of a very suspenseful story here by telling you the last few pages of the book. Several small and large miracles happened over the span of the trial, which lasted almost 4 years and placed 200 witnesses on the stand and cost German taxpayers several $1 million. Then something magical happened. On the day of the verdict, all the cynical family members of the survivors and other refugees gathered in front of the courthouse on the street, having written their angry placards, certain that they would have to protest the verdict. But when they heard the words of the verdict, they threw away their gloomy placards, grabbed the hand of the person that was next to them, and began dancing. This is a scene of one of the lawyers and the widow of one of the victims walking out of the courtroom that day. The judgment of the court had unabashedly named names. Not since World War II had ruling officials still in power been implicated as culprits of crimes. What no court anywhere had ever done, the prosecutor and the judges in this court in Berlin did. They spoke truth to power. They acted without fear. They found Iran's highest leadership, the supreme leader, president, foreign minister, implicated in these crimes, and said so. They gave the refugees justice, treated them as citizens, and as such, inspired them to act as invested citizens. Above all, every EU nation cut ties with Iran as a result of this verdict. By May 1997, every European ambassador had been recalled. Iran had no Western allies anywhere in the world, and you might wonder, what was the gift of this diplomatic blackout? The open season on the nation's best and brightest on the list of 500 came to a halt. Terrorism suffered a major but peaceful blow. Justice is not only about punishing the guilty or vindicating the innocent. Justice has the power to lift everyone, even the bystander, sometimes a people. And justice may well be at times the most efficient and cost-effective approach to solve a problem, in this case, the most cost-effective approach to terrorism. Thank you.